Picture this, a grown man, a prince, sitting in a mansion on the other side of the world, quietly terrified of a child who isn't even a teenager yet. That isn't a joke. It's the story I'm about to tell you. Because Prince Harry's biggest fear right now isn't the press. It isn't money, although that appears to be crumbling as well. It isn't even his fractured relationship with his father. It's a 12-year-old boy, his own nephew, Prince George. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. That fear is finally becoming reality, right before the eyes of the entire world. And there's nothing Harry can do to stop it. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand the strange and tragic psychology behind it all. How an entire decade was wasted, how a golden opportunity slammed shut while he was looking the other way, and how nearly every problem Harry faces today, the struggling charities, the broken family relationships, the fading relevance, and the growing resentment can all be traced back to a single root cause. This isn't a story about a cartoon villain. It's something far more interesting and far more useful. It's the story of a man who was handed nearly everything a person could want, only to throw it away chasing the wrong things, while the one warning he should have listened to came from his own mouth. Let me show you exactly how it happened, step by step. Let's begin with the fear itself, because it's more specific than you might imagine. The concern that has haunted Harry for years is simple. He has always dreaded being overshadowed by his brother's children. And now, that fear is becoming reality. Prince George is growing up. By all accounts, he is becoming a handsome, poised young man. He is slowly stepping into the public eye. And as that happens, something is changing. The spotlight is shifting, and Harry can feel it moving away from him. Now think about what that actually means for someone like Harry. Here's an uncomfortable truth, one that applies to far more people than just princes. There was a time when Harry was the cheeky one, the charming spare, the roguish younger brother whose jokes always landed, whose grin disarmed everyone in the room, and whose every public appearance generated genuine affection and warmth. For a while, he was the people's favorite. He was the relatable royal, the one who seemed the most human. But time, as they say, is undefeated. It comes for everyone, and it comes for charm faster than most things. As the years pass, as the hairline quietly recedes, as the complaints grow longer and less compelling, and as the jokes that once delighted people no longer land the way they used to, that role inevitably begins to fade. It has to. It happens to all of us, in one way or another. Anyone who has crossed into their 40s knows the feeling, that subtle realization that you're no longer the bright young thing in the room, that the energy and attention have shifted towards someone newer. It's one of the quiet, universal sorrows of being human. The cheeky young man is always eventually replaced. That isn't cruelty. It's simply the arithmetic of time. And Harry, of all people, is being replaced by the very thing he feared most. Not by a rival, not by an enemy, but by the next generation, by a child, by his own brother's son, growing up healthy, grounded, and admired. A boy who has done absolutely nothing wrong, simply existing and maturing as children naturally do. There is a particular kind of sadness in that, isn't there? To be eclipsed not by someone who wronged you, but by an innocent boy whose only offense is growing up. It makes any resentment seem all the more irrational, and all the more revealing of what may truly be happening beneath the surface. But this is where the story becomes genuinely tragic. Because Harry once had a window of opportunity, a real one. A golden opportunity that most people in his position could only dream of. And he wasted it. Completely. Let me explain why. Because this is the part that changes everything. Years ago, when George was still a small child, a toddler, really no more than 3 or 4 years old, he was not yet taking part in public royal duties. During that period, Harry had something incredibly valuable. He had time. He had space. He had the full attention and affection of the public, along with a clear and open runway to build something meaningful and lasting. Prince William had deliberately chosen to give his children as normal an upbringing as possible, keeping them largely out of the relentless glare of public attention. And do you see what that meant for Harry? It meant the stage was wide open. The spotlight was his, entirely his to use however he wished. He could have built a legacy that lasted half a century. He could have devoted himself to causes that genuinely changed lives. He could have cemented his place as one of the most admired and respected members of the royal family, a figure associated with service, purpose, and compassion for decades to come. But what did he do with that precious, irreplaceable opportunity? He filled it with grievances. He filled it with exhausting legal battles that consumed years, cost enormous sums of money, and achieved very little. He filled it with public accusations against his own family and with repeated efforts to criticize his brother and the Princess of Wales. Think about the scale of that lost opportunity. The most valuable years of his public life. The years when people were still eager to listen, still willing to support him. And he spent them not building, but burning. Not creating, but tearing down. Not healing old wounds, but reopening them again and again before a global audience. And now that window has closed. Quietly. Permanently. It didn't slam shut. It didn't announce its departure. It simply drifted closed while he was looking the other way, distracted by feuds, lawsuits, and an endless sense of grievance. And here's the hard truth about opportunities like that. Once they're gone, they rarely come back. You don't get a second chance. Once the public's attention moves on, it rarely returns on demand. And now George is rising. The moment has passed to someone new, and Harry is left standing in a place where the spotlight once shone brightly on him. So let's look at how this story is being reported and how royal commentators are interpreting it. The discussion has been circulating throughout the royal press for some time. For years, there has been speculation about Harry's long-standing fear of eventually being overshadowed by William's 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. All 3 have grown up in the public eye, much as their uncle once did. But in recent months, attention has focused particularly on George as he prepares to begin secondary school at an institution that has not yet been publicly announced. And that simple, ordinary milestone, a young boy starting a new chapter of his education, has reignited the entire conversation. Much of the renewed interest was sparked by comments from a well-known royal commentator, someone with deep knowledge of the royal family and strong connections to the story of the late Princess Diana. His observation was striking. The very fear that has reportedly haunted Harry for years, the fear of being eclipsed by his brother's children, is now unfolding in real time, simply because George is growing into an impressive and widely admired young man. As the commentator noted, the biggest topic of discussion surrounding George today is where he will attend school. It's an entirely normal and wholesome question for any family. Yet it is precisely the kind of positive, hopeful attention that now surrounds George and naturally draws public interest. And that shift is difficult to ignore. But here's where the story becomes especially revealing. Someone who knew Harry closely, someone who spent extensive time with him and gained rare insight into his thoughts and motivations, has offered a perspective that sheds light on the entire situation. What this person revealed is remarkable. Pay close attention, because this is the part most people never hear. According to a biographer who spent countless hours speaking with Harry in private over an extended period, Harry made a statement years ago that now seems almost prophetic. He admitted that he felt a constant urgency to make his mark on the world. He viewed life almost as a race against a clock that only he could hear ticking. And then he said something that, in hindsight, explains nearly everything. Paraphrasing closely, Harry suggested that he wanted to accomplish something meaningful while people were still interested in him, because he believed there was only a limited window before Prince George would eventually become the center of public attention. He knew his opportunity would not last forever. Now pause and think about that for a moment, because it may be the key to understanding the entire story. He said those words years ago, years before any of this became reality. He understood the situation with remarkable clarity. He saw the clock ticking. He recognized that his time in the spotlight was finite, and that, one day, George would naturally command the public's attention. He wasn't caught by surprise. He identified the challenge himself. He spoke about it openly to someone documenting his life long before it actually happened. In many ways, he predicted his own future with startling accuracy. And that is what makes this story so tragic. Because insight by itself is not enough. You can see a problem coming from miles away. You can understand it perfectly. You can even warn others about it. But if you fail to act on that knowledge, the outcome remains exactly the same. And that is the heartbreaking part. He understood the challenge. He recognized the opportunity. Yet he failed to use that understanding in a way that could have changed the course of his future. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had an entire decade, 10 full years, to act on the very warning he had spoken aloud himself. 10 years to build something that could outlast the spotlight. 10 years to create a legacy that didn't depend on being the cheeky young prince. And if a grown man, blessed with every imaginable resource, cannot find a way to do something meaningful with 10 years of advance warning, it becomes increasingly difficult to feel much sympathy when the day he predicted finally arrives. He was handed a map to his own future, and then he chose to set it on fire. Because think about it, every family has younger relatives who grow up and eventually carve out their own place in the world. That's life. That's normal. Children grow. Attention shifts. The world moves on. A healthy person adapts. A healthy person finds new purpose, new meaning, and new ways to contribute. Harry could have done exactly that. He has 2 children of his own. He could have devoted himself to raising them, building a strong family life, and creating something positive that would endure long after the headlines faded. Instead, the complaints continued. The same grievances, the same frustrations, the same stories repeated year after year. And here's a detail that captures the tragedy of the situation in a single, almost astonishing moment. According to one account, Harry once asked his brother if he could help raise William's children. Let that sink in. The reasoning, apparently, was that he didn't want William's children to experience the same difficulties he believed he had endured growing up. On the surface, it almost sounds touching. But look closer. William's response was reportedly firm and unmistakable. In essence, he said no. When Harry reportedly pressed the issue and asked whether he could play even a small role, the answer remained the same. No. And honestly, who could blame him? Think about what that exchange reveals. Here was a man who, through a series of his own choices, had become a cautionary tale. A man publicly at war with his own family. A man who had spent years criticizing and attacking the very people responsible for raising those children. And yet he wanted a role in shaping their upbringing. Of course William refused. Of course he drew a clear boundary. Any sensible parent would do the same. You don't entrust your children to someone who is actively contributing to conflict within the family. But there's a deeper irony here, one that transforms a sad anecdote into a metaphor for Harry's entire predicament. In being shut out, he found himself trapped inside circumstances that he had helped create. He built the walls around himself and then complained about being confined. Through his own actions, he contributed to the isolation he now laments. The estrangement he speaks about wasn't simply something that happened to him. It was also the result of choices made over many years, brick by brick, decision by decision, grievance by grievance. And that is one reason why sympathy becomes difficult for many observers. Now, let's be clear-eyed about something. This is a prince, a man with enormous wealth, a beautiful home, and advantages that most people could only dream of. Yes, some observers argue that he has allowed others to exert significant influence over his decisions. But those decisions were still his to make. No one forced them upon him. When you have 10 years of warning, every resource imaginable, and a clear path ahead, yet arrive at the present consumed by resentment rather than accomplishment, people naturally begin to ask questions. How does so much opportunity produce so little fulfillment? So, where does the bitterness come from? Why would someone with every conceivable advantage remain so consumed by grievance? According to a biographer who spent significant time with Harry during those years, the answer is more complicated and more heartbreaking than many people realize. She describes a Harry who, before everything unraveled, seemed to be improving. During their conversations, she recalls moments when he appeared hopeful. He would say things like, "I feel much better now. I'm getting there. I'm doing quite well. I'm going to be able to do this, and this, and this." There was optimism in those moments. There was a man trying to move forward, a man finding his footing, a man beginning to imagine a brighter future. By her account, he was healing. He could see a path ahead. And then, according to her interpretation, everything changed. A new relationship entered his life, and from that point onward, she believes the trajectory reversed. Rather than moving upward, she argues that he was pulled back into old grievances and resentments. She describes a dynamic in which he became increasingly convinced that his family had wronged him and that his emotional wounds ran deeper than he had previously believed. Now, this is one person's perspective, and it should be treated as exactly that, a perspective, not an established fact. But the underlying lesson is worth considering because it applies to all of us, whether we're princes or ordinary people. The people you surround yourself with matter. They can lift you up, or they can pull you down. There is rarely a neutral outcome. Some relationships inspire growth, confidence, and resilience. Others, whether intentionally or unintentionally, make life feel heavier, darker, and more difficult to navigate. The people closest to us often shape the direction of our lives more than we realize. And that brings us to the comparison often made in these discussions. Supporters of this argument point to the Princess of Wales and her role in William's life. By many accounts, she has provided stability, encouragement, and support. Together, they have built a partnership that appears to strengthen both family and duty. William has grown into his responsibilities. He has matured as a husband, father, and future king. And many observers credit part of that growth to the steady presence beside him. Because that is what a strong partnership does. It helps you carry life's burdens. It doesn't add more weight to them. A true partner is someone who, when you stumble, reaches down to help you back to your feet, rather than stepping on your hand. By contrast, this biographer describes a series of small but telling moments that, whether entirely accurate or not, paint a vivid picture of the opposite dynamic. Moments of control. Moments in which one partner allegedly speaks over the other. Moments of criticism, correction, and subtle diminishment. Moments in which a man appears to be made smaller in front of others. One account even describes Harry being seated at a children's table during an event while his partner sat among the most prominent guests. It's the sort of quiet humiliation that, if repeated often enough, can slowly erode a person's confidence. And perhaps the saddest part of this interpretation is the suggestion that you can see it written across his face. The fading energy, the diminished spark, the gradual dimming of a light that once seemed brighter. Yet, according to this theory, he cannot bring himself to change course. Perhaps because he still loves her. Perhaps because he cannot bear to admit he made a mistake. Or perhaps because both things are true. After all, very few people want to say out loud, "I got it wrong. I made a terrible mistake." So instead, the theory goes, he stays. He shrinks. And he complains. Now, once again, this is only one person's interpretation of a marriage. None of us can see behind closed doors, and any outside assessment should be treated with caution. But the principle beneath it is undeniable, and it applies to every person watching this. The people you surround yourself with shape who you become. Choose those who lift you up. Avoid those who pull you down. Because over the course of a decade, that single decision can compound into two completely different lives. And that brings us to the lesson at the heart of this story. If you take nothing else away from it, remember this. Choose a partner who helps you build your life, not one who fills it with negativity, resentment, and endless complaint. Because the difference between those two paths can be profound. The argument often made here is simple. Same family, similar opportunities, the same starting line, yet two vastly different destinations. And in this interpretation, one of the key differences lies in the people each man chose to stand beside. Now let's pause and take stock, because this may be the question that cuts deepest of all. When Harry looks back over the last decade, what does he see? What can he point to and say, "That is my legacy. That is what I built. That is what I will be remembered for"? The painful answer, according to his critics, is that much of the decade has been consumed by grievance, by complaint, by conflict. And here comes the cruelest twist of all. Even some of his genuine accomplishments, the real achievements that once earned widespread respect, have, in the eyes of many, become overshadowed by later controversies. Consider his military service. For years, it was one of the strongest and most widely admired parts of his public story. He served his country. He deployed overseas. He earned genuine respect from people across the political and social spectrum. That respect wasn't handed to him. It was earned. Yet critics argue that some of the revelations contained in his memoir damaged what had once been viewed as an untouchable source of pride. In their view, he took one of his greatest strengths and unintentionally gave his detractors an opening to challenge it. Now consider his charitable work. This was supposed to become the foundation of his post-royal identity. The proof that stepping away from royal duties would allow him to pursue meaningful change on a larger scale. The evidence that he had left in order to do greater good. Yet critics argue that many of those ambitions failed to meet expectations. Projects struggled. Organizations faced controversy. And the vision that once seemed so promising became increasingly difficult to sustain. Notice the pattern, because understanding that pattern is crucial. When people list Harry's most widely respected achievements, many of them come from the earlier chapters of his life, before the years of public conflict, before the constant disputes, before the bitterness that now dominates so much of the conversation. The accomplishments were concentrated near the beginning. Much of the admiration was earned while he was still a working member of the royal family. And the decade that followed, the very decade he once acknowledged was precious and limited, produced far less than many expected. That is the tragedy, distilled into a single painful observation. The years he knew were most important were the years he spent fighting battles that left little behind. But there is a deeper lesson here, one that extends far beyond Harry and makes this story worth discussing in the first place. Every person faces hardship, real hardship, pain, loss, illness, betrayal, grief. The entire brutal catalog of human suffering eventually touches every life. Harry lost his mother as a child. That is a profound wound. A tragedy that deserves genuine compassion. No reasonable person denies that pain. But pain alone does not determine the outcome of a life. What matters is what we choose to do with it. The people who rise are not necessarily the people who suffer less. They are often the people who refuse to let suffering define them forever. They refuse to sit among the wreckage and declare themselves finished. They refuse to allow the worst thing that ever happened to them to become the only thing that matters about them. They get back up, again and again. They keep moving forward. They decide that their hardships and the people who hurt them will not have the final word. They tell themselves, I am going to build something. I am going to move forward. I am going to be okay. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative is surrender. Nobody escapes disappointment. Nobody escapes heartbreak. Nobody escapes worry. But the people who come through those struggles discover something inside themselves, a stubborn determination that refuses to give up, a voice that says, I will find a way, because no magical rescue is coming. No fairy tale solution is waiting around the corner. Most of the time, the work has to be done by you, one difficult day at a time. And that is precisely what Harry's critics argue he failed to do. He had the resources. He had the platform. He had the opportunity. He had the warning. Yet instead of building, they say he chose to complain. Instead of creating, he chose to blame. Instead of taking ownership of his future, he embraced a narrative in which someone else was always responsible for his unhappiness. And whether that assessment is fair or unfair, it highlights an important truth. Resentment can become a habit, and habits are choices repeated over time. Which brings us to one final question. Why do William and Catherine appear to maintain such firm boundaries? Why the careful distance? Why the unmistakable line they seem unwilling to cross? The answer, according to many observers, is surprisingly simple. They're protecting their children, not as royals, as parents. Think about it from that perspective. Children absorb far more than adults realize. A single sentence can leave a lasting impression. Imagine a young child repeatedly hearing that his future will be miserable, that his role is a burden, that disappointment awaits him. It takes very little for anxiety to take root in a young mind. And once those fears are planted, they can shape how a child sees himself, his future, and the world around him. Children often inherit the fears of the adults closest to them. And that is precisely why parents are so careful about who gets close enough to influence them. Children absorb the fears anxieties, and attitudes of the adults around them. A boy on the verge of adolescence, already navigating the unusual pressures of growing up in the public eye, is especially vulnerable to that kind of influence. From this perspective, the boundary William and Catherine have drawn is not an act of cruelty. It is not pettiness. It is not spite. And it is not family politics. It is parenthood in its most protective form. It is two parents identifying a potential risk and deciding to shield their children from it, regardless of the personal cost. They have recognized the single most important responsibility of their lives, and they are protecting it with everything they have. And if that means keeping a troubled uncle at arm's length, then so be it. The children come first. They will always come first. And what is that responsibility? What is the mission at the very center of William and Catherine's world? It is raising the next generation to be fundamentally different, to avoid seeing themselves as permanent victims of circumstance, to avoid carrying grievances as though they were treasured possessions, to grow up grounded, resilient, grateful, and dutiful rather than bitter, resentful, and convinced that the world owes them something. That is the project at the heart of their lives. And here is the quietly devastating reality. It stands in deliberate contrast to much of what Harry has come to represent in the eyes of his critics. In this interpretation, they are intentionally raising their children to avoid repeating the mistakes they believe have harmed previous generations. Harry is not simply being kept at a distance. He has, in some ways, become a cautionary example, a living lesson in how not to handle the extraordinary pressures that accompany privilege and public life. Now, I promised we would return to the subject of charity work, because this is where the story becomes considerably darker. Serious allegations have been raised regarding one of Harry's major African conservation initiatives. Reports have described disturbing claims connected to the organization, including accusations of abuse and concerns about oversight. These allegations remain deeply troubling and have prompted difficult questions about accountability and leadership. Consider the weight of that for a moment. This is a man who has frequently spoken of his love for Africa, its people, and its wildlife. Yet critics point out that he had not personally visited this particular project for many years. That naturally raises a question. What changed? Why the growing distance from a cause he once appeared deeply committed to? One explanation offered by those familiar with his earlier passions traces the story back to his relationship with his late mother. According to this view, many of these charitable commitments were, in part, a way of honoring her memory. There was something genuine and deeply personal behind that connection, a desire to remain close to the parent he lost so young, a desire to continue causes she cared about. But according to some commentators, that passion gradually faded over time, not because of a dramatic decision, not because of a public announcement, but because of simple absence. One missed visit became several, distance became routine, and eventually involvement diminished. Whether that explanation is entirely fair or not, the larger point remains worth considering. Commitment requires presence, passion requires participation, and leadership requires engagement. Some commentators have even described this pattern as Harry's charity curse. One organization struggles, another faces controversy. Questions emerge around initiatives that were once celebrated. Viewed together, it can appear as though misfortune follows him wherever he goes. But there is a more practical interpretation. It isn't a curse. A curse is something imposed from outside, something beyond your control. This is something different. It is the predictable consequence of disengagement. When you attach your name to serious and complex causes but fail to remain actively involved, problems eventually emerge. Organizations drift, oversight weakens, difficulties compound, and things begin to fall apart. That isn't mysterious. It isn't supernatural. It is simply what happens when leadership becomes absent. The old saying remains true. Organizations often reflect the quality of their leadership. To be fair, the challenges facing conservation groups and humanitarian organizations are immense. Conservation work often takes place in remote and difficult environments where conflict over land, resources, and livelihoods can create dangerous situations. Charities serving vulnerable communities face obstacles that would challenge anyone. No one is pretending these are easy missions. But the answer to difficulty is not to disengage. The answer is to become more involved, to understand the realities on the ground, to remain present, to lead consistently, year after year. Loving a cause from a distance is easy. Defending and nurturing that cause through difficult times is far harder. And that distinction lies at the center of much of the criticism directed toward Harry. Now consider the contrast between the two brothers. While critics argue that Harry's projects have suffered from disengagement, William appears focused on defining his future role with purpose and intention. One recent example offers a fascinating glimpse into that approach. Reports suggest that William declined the idea of holding a grand formal investiture ceremony after becoming Prince of Wales following Queen Elizabeth II's death and King Charles III's accession. This would have been the kind of elaborate public spectacle that marked previous generations. Instead, he reportedly chose a more restrained approach, and the reasoning is revealing. According to reports, William believes modern institutions must adapt to changing public expectations. He reportedly feels that the public values humility, relevance, and service more than lavish displays of ceremony. In his view, trust is earned through authenticity and meaningful contribution rather than pageantry alone. Whether one agrees with that philosophy or not, it demonstrates something important. He is actively thinking about the future. He is making deliberate decisions about what the monarchy should become. He is engaged. He is present. He is doing the work. And that stands in sharp contrast to the criticism often directed at his brother. Of course, reasonable people can disagree about how much tradition should be preserved. Many argue that royal pageantry remains an important part of the monarchy's appeal. The ceremonies, the symbolism, the sense of history, the spectacle that attracts people from around the world. There is genuine value in those traditions. Perhaps the best path forward lies somewhere in the middle, preserving the magic while reducing unnecessary excess. But the larger point remains. William appears focused on building something for the future. He is shaping a vision. He is making choices. And he is actively engaged in the process. That engagement is what separates builders from spectators. Now there is one final cloud hanging over the wider royal family that cannot be ignored. The continuing controversy surrounding Prince Andrew remains one of the most damaging scandals the institution has faced in modern times. New allegations and reports continue to emerge, keeping the issue firmly in the public consciousness. And this matters because it creates the backdrop against which all of these other stories unfold. On one hand, some argue that the severity of the Andrew scandal makes Harry's controversies appear less significant by comparison. Against allegations of such magnitude, family disputes and public complaints can seem relatively minor. Some observers have even suggested that Harry should be welcomed back while Andrew remains excluded. But that comparison is misleading. One wrongdoing does not erase another. The existence of a larger scandal does not eliminate the consequences of smaller ones. Problems are not measured solely against the worst example available. On the other hand, the Andrew controversy reinforces a broader concern. It highlights the pressure on the monarchy to avoid repeating past mistakes, and it helps explain why William and Catherine appear so determined to raise their children differently. Their goal seems clear: to raise future royals who are grounded, responsible, disciplined, resilient, people who avoid becoming scandals, cautionary tales, or sources of embarrassment. Every decision they make appears connected to that objective. Every boundary, every parenting choice, every modernization effort, all driven by a single conviction: not again, not on our watch, not with our children. And that brings us back to where we began. A prince sitting in a mansion, worried about a 12-year-old boy. Because now the full picture comes into focus. The fear was never really about George. George is simply a child, a boy growing up, a young person preparing for his future. He has done nothing wrong. What Harry fears, according to this interpretation, is what George represents. The passage of time, the arrival of the next generation, the opportunities that were once available but are now gone. Harry saw the window. He spoke about it himself. He understood that his moment would not last forever. He knew that one day the spotlight would shift. And with all that knowledge, with years of warning, extraordinary resources, and countless opportunities, his critics argue that he chose grievance over growth, conflict over legacy, resentment over renewal. And now, as George gradually steps into public life, Harry is forced to watch the future arrive exactly as he once predicted. In the end, that is what makes the story feel tragic. Not because the outcome was unforeseeable, but because the warning was there all along. And the deeper lesson extends far beyond royalty. Time moves on. The spotlight shifts. Youth fades. A new generation rises. That has always been true, and it always will be. The question is not whether that process will happen. It will. The real question is what you choose to do with the time you are given. Will you build, or will you burn? Will you heal, or will you cling to old wounds? Will you surround yourself with people who elevate you, or with people who pull you downward? Those choices determine far more than circumstance ever will. And perhaps the saddest detail of all is this. By his own account, Harry saw the clock ticking long before anyone else did. He recognized the shrinking window. He understood the challenge. He simply failed to act on what he already knew. He saw the iceberg and never changed course. So as you watch this story unfold, ask yourself the only question that truly matters. Not what Harry did, but what you will do. Because your own window will come. In your career, in your relationships, in your opportunities, in those brief seasons when life offers you a chance to build something meaningful. And when that moment arrives, will you build or will you burn? Will you rise or will you sink? Because in the end, that may be the one decision none of us can afford to get wrong. Harry says he heard the warning years ago. The real question is whether the rest of us will listen to ours.